Welcome back, class. Mr. Rasmussen here. This is the beginning of our 13th unit in advanced biology. That's exciting. 13 units later, we walked 13 units ago. You were walking into my class, and I was explaining to you that you'd be watching videos at home. And here you are. You've watched videos at home this year, and we've done a lot of really cool stuff in class that normally we wouldn't be able to because you'd be listening to me talk about this stuff in class. So thank you for watching these at home. Thank you for. I hope they've been semi-enjoyable, at least to you. They've been fun for me to make. So this is our introduction into the nervous system, and this is going to be just like the circulatory system, just a short introduction. We'll be done here in 5 minutes, so don't hold me to it. So this is our nervous system introduction. Our nervous system is big, and it's complex, and it's really important. It helps control everything we do. Everything our body does is controlled by the nervous system. This huge nervous system, this huge complex connection of nerve fibers and support cells, neurons, and all sorts of other stuff, we divide them into two categories. So we split our nervous system into two categories, or what we call divisions. And the first division is our central nervous system. And this runs right down, just like we have our axial skeleton and our appendicular skeleton. Our central nervous system is axial to our body, so it runs right down the center. That's why we call it the central nervous system. Sometimes you'll hear it called CNS. They just shorten it to CNS. So that's the central nervous system. The central nervous system basically contains two components, and I know it says 3 over here, but we're going to ignore the third one. It contains the brain, and you guessed it, the spinal cord. So our central nervous system is basically just the brain and the spinal cord. And we'll take a unit where we'll talk about the brain and the spinal cord. Actually, we'll get each of their own videos. So those are important components. But those two together, the brain and the spinal cord together, we call our central nervous system. And if you guessed it, we don't call it an appendicular, just like our skeleton. That would make sense, but we call it something different. We call it the peripheral nervous system, and that contains all these other nerves. There are lots of other nerves in your body, a huge plethora of nerves in your body, and they fall into your peripheral nervous system. So we have actually brains, I hope we have brains. We have nerves coming off of our brain, and they're called cranial nerves. And then we have these brains coming off, brains. I got brains on the brain today. We have these nerves coming off of the spinal cord, and they are called spinal nerves. So we have cranial nerves and spinal nerves. And so the peripheral nervous system is sort of broken down a little bit. The next thing I'm going to show you is this big chart, and I know it's complex and I know it's weird, but I just want you to get an understanding of how these things are broken down, and just some maybe an introductory level of information on what they are. So here we go. So if we're going to look at, our peripheral nervous system contains neurons or nerves. Okay, so our peripheral nervous system, so we're looking at just the peripheral nervous system, has a layout to it. So there's a huge layout to the way the peripheral nervous system is arranged. So if we look at this, I talked about this before. You have two types of nerves in the peripheral nervous system. You have cranial nerves, and they come off your brain. And you have spinal nerves, and they come off your spine, right? That makes sense. Cranial's in your head, spinal's off your spine. So you have two types of nerves, cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Well, these nerves are broken down into two major types. And your cranial nerves and your spinal nerves can be either of these types. So you can have sensory cranial nerves, or you can have sensory spinal nerves. The other ones are motor nerves, and you can have cranial motor nerves and cranial spinal nerves, or motor spinal nerves. And there's also another type of nerve down here that I didn't put on here, and they're called interneurons, and they go in between nerves. Interneuron. But so that's the major part. So we have cranial nerves and spinal nerves, and they can either be sensory, they can detect, sense information, or they can send information to muscles. If we break down the motor nerves, these motor nerves have a bunch of different types. They either belong to the somatic system or the autonomic system. Okay, and the somatic system is our actual control over our muscles. So if I want to move my arm, I'd be using my somatic system. My autonomic system is going to control things that aren't really in my direct control. And we'll learn more about that later. And these autonomic system is actually divided into two parts. And for those of you who've taken psychology, you maybe have talked about this. But they are our sympathetic system and our parasympathetic system. They are our resting response and our fight and flight response. So this is sort of the layout of how things go, and I'll just run through it real quick. I'll run through it as a review. So you either have cranial nerves or spinal nerves, and those cranial nerves and spinal nerves can either be sensory or motor, right? They can control your senses or they can control your movement. And they can, the motor nerves are either in your control, somatic, so they're like controlling your arm, or they're autonomic, they're out of your control. They control things like heart rate, stuff like that. And then these autonomic system can either be sympathetic or parasympathetic, and that's your fight or flight response, or your resting response. So those are our two major systems, the layout of the peripheral nervous system, your spine and your brain, and that is your introduction to the nervous system. Next lesson we will talk about the anatomy of a neuron, and I know we talked about it in 10th grade, but I just want you to be familiar with it. After that, we're going to talk about how a nerve works, and then we'll talk about what's going on at the synapse level, and then after that we're going to talk about your brain, your spinal cord, and these pieces. So, if you have any questions, ask me in class. Thanks, class. Bye.